There is a specific kind of terror that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with raised voices or slammed doors or the kind of obvious cruelty that the people around you would be able to see and name and confirm. It arrives quietly. It arrives in the form of a man who loves you telling you, with complete patience and visible concern, that the thing you just heard him say is not what you heard. That the conversation you remember having did not happen the way you remember it. That the feeling you are experiencing right now is not a response to something real, but a symptom of something inside you that has been concerning him for a while. It arrives in the form of being gently and repeatedly redirected away from your own perception of reality by the person whose job it is to be your anchor to it. And the most devastating part, the part that makes this particular kind of terror so effective and so difficult to escape, is that it is delivered in the language of love. He is not telling you that you are wrong because he wants to hurt you. He is telling you because he is worried about you. He has always been worried about you. And slowly, over months and years, you begin to believe that the worry is justified, that the problem is you, that if you could just get yourself together the way he keeps gently suggesting you should, everything would be fine. She spent 3 years believing this. 3 years in which she watched herself become a person she did not recognize, smaller, more uncertain, more dependent on the reassurance of the man who was systematically dismantling her sense of herself. And then one day something shifted. Not dramatically, not with a single revelation or a confrontation or a moment of cinematic clarity. Something shifted the way a tide shifts, slowly, and then completely, and then there is no going back to what the shore looked like before. Welcome to VENOMTHREAD, where the truth is darker than fiction. And tonight we are going inside the architecture of a manipulation so complete that even she could not see it while she was living in it. Her name was Nadia. She was 31 years old when she met a man named Joel at a mutual friends gathering and felt within the first conversation that she had met someone genuinely rare. Not rare in the way of obvious charm or easy magnetism. She had met plenty of that and had long since learned to distrust it. Rare in the way of attentiveness. Joel listened. Not the performed listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the actual listening of a person who was taking in what you said and filing it and referencing it later in ways that made you feel held and remembered and genuinely known. He asked questions that went one layer deeper than the questions most people asked. He remembered details from previous conversations that she had half forgotten herself. He had, in the language that she would later use when describing him to people who had not met him, a quality of presence that made you feel like the most interesting and most important person in any room he was also in. She had not felt that before. She did not know yet that what she was experiencing was not rare attentiveness, but a very specific and very practiced form of information gathering. She did not know that every detail she gave him freely in those early conversations was being cataloged not because she was interesting to him, but because she was useful. She did not know that yet. She was 31 and she was falling in love, and the two things felt exactly the same. They moved in together at the 8-month mark. This was faster than Nadia's previous relationships had moved, and she had mentioned this to a friend who had met Joel and liked him and had said with the particular confidence of someone who has never been inside a situation. It is different when you know. You just know. And Nadia had accepted this because it felt true. She did know. She was certain in a way she had not understand yet was that the certainty she felt was not entirely her own. It had been carefully constructed. Joel had spent 8 months learning the specific language of Nadia's desires and fears, and had been feeding that language back to her in the form of himself, becoming, through sustained and deliberate performance, the precise version of a person she had always wanted. The man she moved in with was not a person. He was a reflection, a mirror so perfectly calibrated to show her exactly what she had always wanted to see that she had never thought to look at the edges of the frame where the real person lived. The first sign was so small that she did not register it as a sign at all. She registered it as a mistake. She had told a story at dinner with friends, a story about something that had happened at her workplace that week, and Joel had, gently and without apparent agenda, corrected a detail in the story. Not dramatically. He had simply said, "I thought you told me it happened on Thursday, not Wednesday." And Nadia had stopped and tried to remember and had not been entirely sure. It was Wednesday, she thought. But Thursday was also possible. She had said maybe and moved on and thought nothing more of it. The second sign came 3 weeks later. The third came 2 weeks after that. Each one was its own small and apparently inconsequential moment of gentle correction. A date she had misremembered. A conversation she had recalled differently from how Joel recalled it. An emotional response she had described as feeling small that Joel had reframed as feeling sensitive. Each correction had its own logic. Each one was delivered with the specific tone of a person who was helping her. And because each one arrived separately and weeks apart, and in the language of care rather than criticism, she did not see the pattern. She only felt, gradually, and without being able to name the source of the feeling, that she was becoming less reliable, that her memory was less than she had believed it to be, that her emotional responses were somewhat larger than situations warranted. She began, without consciously deciding to check herself before speaking, to qualify her statements with phrases like "I think," or "I might be wrong about this," or "correct me if I am misremembering." She was doing this inside a year of living with him. She did not notice when it started. She only noticed that it had. The escalation was invisible as it happened and obvious in retrospect. Joel began to use what he had learned about Nadia's history against her. Not aggressively. Never aggressively. He used it the way a surgeon uses information, precisely and with the appearance of care. Nadia had spoken early in their relationship about her mother, who had struggled with anxiety, and about her own history of anxiety in her early 20s that she had worked through and largely resolved. She had shared this freely because she had trusted him with it, and because at the time it had felt like the kind of intimacy that deepens a relationship. It became, over the following 2 years, the primary instrument of her management. When she expressed concern about something Joel had done or said, the concern was quietly redirected into her history of anxiety. Not in a diagnostic or clinical way. In the specific language of a loving partner who had heard her talk about her own patterns and was gently reflecting them back to her. He would say things like, "I wonder if this is connected to what you described about your 20s. He would say, "I am not criticizing you. I just want to make sure you are okay." He would say, "You seem like you are in one of your periods." And Nadia would hear these things from the person she trusted most, and she would turn them over and she would find, every single time, just enough purchase for doubt to get its fingers in. Just enough history in herself to make the question of whether he was right a genuinely open question. The answer to the question was always no. He was never right. But she did not know that yet because she had not yet understood that the question itself was the weapon. By the end of year 2, she had stopped telling most of her friends what was happening at home. Not because Joel had told her to. He had never done anything as visible as that. But because the version of events that she carried out of their apartment and into her friendships was always the corrected version. The version in which her concern had turned out to be disproportionate. The version in which she had misremembered or overreacted or been in one of her periods. She had internalized his corrections so thoroughly that she was performing them preemptively now. She was managing her own narrative before she even opened her mouth, trimming away the parts that would make her sound unreliable or unstable or difficult, which were the parts that were true, which were the parts that would have told anyone who heard them exactly what was happening. She was, without being aware of it, doing Joel's work for him. She had become so practiced at doubting herself that she no longer needed him to do it. She was keeping herself small and uncertain and dependent on his interpretation of reality using tools he had given her and that she now carried independently. This is what successful long-term gaslighting looks like from the inside. It does not look like control. It looks like you. The moment of shift arrived, as these moments often do, not from inside the relationship, but from outside it. A colleague named Freya who had known Nadia for 6 years, and who had watched her change over the previous 2, without being able to name what she was watching, said something to her over lunch one afternoon that was not intended as anything more than an observation. Freya said, "You know what I have noticed about you lately? You apologize before you finish your sentences. You start a thought, and then you apologize for it before anyone has responded to it. You used to be one of the most direct people I knew, and now every sentence you say has a maybe or an I might be wrong attached to it. Where did that come from?" Nadia had sat with that observation for the entire afternoon. She had not been able to put it down. She had turned it over and examined it from every angle, and she had found that it was accurate. She did apologize before finishing her sentences. She did qualify everything. She did lead with uncertainty in a way she had not previously. And she could not find, when she looked for it, a moment when she had decided to start doing that. It had just become how she spoke, how she existed, how she moved through rooms and conversations and her own thoughts. The question that arrived that afternoon and that she could not subsequently put down was this. If she had not decided to become this person, who had? She did not confront Joel immediately. Instead, she started writing things down. This was not a deliberate strategic decision at first. It started as a way of checking herself, of having a record she could return to rather than relying solely on a memory she had been taught to distrust. She began noting conversations, not at length, just the date and the substance, and her immediate reaction before she had time to correct it into the version Joel's interpretation would produce. She did this for 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, she read back through what she had written, and she experienced something she described to me later as the sensation of looking at an X-ray of a fracture you had been told was a bruise. The pattern was undeniable when it was laid out with dates attached. Every conversation in which she had expressed a concern or a need or a perception that differed from Joel's preferred version of events was followed, within 48 hours, by a conversation in which that concern or need or perception was gently redirected back to her as a symptom of something internal. Without exception. 6 weeks of data. Every single time. The concern was always hers. The problem was always her. The solution was always some version of the suggestion that she needed to work on herself. And she had been accepting this solution for 2 years, and working on herself, and the working on herself had produced not improvement but erosion, because the thing she was being told to work on was not a flaw. It was her accuracy. She made an appointment with a therapist. Not the therapist that Joel had suggested she see 8 months earlier, a suggestion she had accepted and then discontinued when the therapist had asked questions about her relationship that had felt to Nadia at the time like overreach, but that she now understood were the questions of a professional who had recognized something Nadia was not yet ready to name. She made an appointment with a different therapist, a woman she found independently through a recommendation from Freya, and she went to the first session alone, and she brought the 6 weeks of notes, and she laid them on the table, and she said, "I need you to tell me if I am crazy or if something is wrong." The therapist read through the notes carefully, and then she looked at Nadia, and she said something that Nadia has told me she will carry for the rest of her life. The therapist said, "You are not crazy. What is in these notes is a documented pattern of a specific behavior. What you have been experiencing has a name, and the name is not your anxiety. The name belongs to what is being done to you." And in the moment those words arrived, Nadia felt, simultaneously, the most devastating and the most clarifying feeling she had ever experienced. Devastating because if what the therapist was describing was true, then the previous 2 years had not been her failure to manage herself. They had been something done to her by someone who had chosen to do it. And clarifying because if that was true, then the floor she had been told was unstable was not unstable at all. It was being shaken, and the person shaking it was standing right next to her pretending to help her balance. The exit took 4 months to plan. Not because Nadia was afraid of Joel in a physical sense. She was not, and would be clear about that. But because she understood that the same intelligence that had constructed the gaslighting would be brought to bear on the dismantling of it if he saw it coming. She had lived with a person who was expert at managing other people's perception of reality. She had 2 years of personal evidence of how effective that expertise was. She was not going to give him the opportunity to manage her exit the way he had managed everything else. She needed to leave in a way that was complete and final, and that removed his ability to redirect the narrative before she was safely out of reach of it. She worked with her therapist throughout the 4 months. She quietly moved money she had contributed to their shared accounts into an account in her name only. She identified an apartment and secured it without telling anyone who had any connection to Joel. She told her closest friends, including Freya, the full version of what had been happening, not the corrected version, the actual version, the one she had been trimming and apologizing for and qualifying for 2 years. She watched their faces as she told it. She watched the recognition move across them. She watched several of them say versions of "I noticed something was wrong, but I did not know how to say it." She filed that information away because it was important. She had not been invisible in her diminishment. The people who loved her had seen it. She had been the last to see it because she had been inside it. On a Tuesday morning, Joel left for work at the usual time. Nadia waited 20 minutes. Then she made 3 phone calls in sequence. The first was to her sister who arrived with a rented van. The second was to her new landlord to confirm she was coming that day. The The third was to Joel's phone, not to speak to him, but to leave a message because she had decided he deserved a message, and the message was this: I am leaving. I have been leaving for 4 months. Everything I am taking is mine. Everything remaining in the apartment is yours. I am not contactable at any previous number or address. I want you to understand that I know what you did, not the general shape of it, the specific mechanism of it, and the specific timeline, and the specific moments in which you chose to use what I told you about myself against me. I know all of it. I am not angry. I am clear. Those are not the same thing. She hung up. She and her sister moved for 6 hours. By the time Joel returned to the apartment that evening, Nadia was in a different neighborhood in a space that had only her name on the lease and only her choices in it, and where the air, she said, tasted different from the air she had been breathing for 2 years. It took her a long time to identify what was different about it, and eventually she identified it. It was honest. She was breathing honest air for the first time in 2 years, and the difference was physical and immediate, and she sat on the floor of her new empty apartment that evening and felt it move through her, and she did not cry. She had been crying for 2 years, and she was done with that. What she felt instead was the very first edges of the thing she had been told did not exist in her, her own clarity. Intact. Recovered. Hers. I asked Nadia what she would say to a woman who was right now in the middle of what she had been in the middle of, who was apologizing before she finished sentences and qualifying everything she said and feeling, without being able to name why, that she had become smaller than she used to be. Nadia thought about it for a moment, and then she said, I would say write it down. Not for anyone else. For yourself. Write down what happened today and what you felt about it before anyone tells you. What you should have felt about it. Do that for a month, and then read it back, because the pattern is there. It is always there. You do not need to be a detective or have 41 pages of evidence or understand the clinical language for what is happening to you. You just need to read what you actually wrote before the correction arrived. The correction is the clue. The correction is always the clue. She paused, and then she said, You are not going crazy. Going crazy looks like this from the inside because someone is working very hard to make it look exactly like that. But it is not you. It has never been you. Trust what you wrote before he told you what you should have written. That version of you, the one who existed before the correction, is still in there. She did not go anywhere. She was just waiting for you to come back for her. That is the work. Going back for her. She is worth going back for. Thank you for being here on VENOMTHREAD. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. New darkness next week. We are not done.